Audio Jungle.
Hello, welcome to Law Excellence. I am Harsha Mannava and we are discussing the book Sapiens, A Brief History of Humankind. So, as I said, we are discussing the timeline, the events between agricultural revolution and scientific revolution. And we said the first assumption was that the first claim we made was that culture has been moving towards unity. And we said that unity can be studied in terms of three areas. 1, economy. 2, political. 3, religious. We discussed first economic, the role of money in leading to human coordination and cooperation. Second, we saw the changes that happened in terms of political aspects. We saw how empires came about and how empires had some bad effects, good effects, and also the nature of empire and how empires facilitate their rule through promoting culture. So the role of culture in sustaining an empire. Today we will talk about the role of religion. In fact, among these three, I think religion is the most important because ancient societies unlike ours were deeply religious. So the religious gave a set of values. They gave a set of values that allowed people to cooperate and coordinate. Without these underlying belief systems, those myths, those common agreements, common view of the world, it would not have been possible for the so-called large-scale trade or for empires to sustain large number of people together. In this video, we'll take a journey, a snapshot of the evolution of religion, how religion went through various phases and discuss the role of ideas or religion in the present day society. So this video will focus on this journey. First, what is the role of religion? That's the first important aspect. As I said, the third great unifier, and in the previous video on there is no justice in history. If you recollect your thoughts from that video, there we have said oppressive social hierarchies have been created and they have been perpetuated and supported through many tools, and one of those was religion. So religion was, in the ancient and medieval societies, religion was everything. It was central to people's lives. It justified the rule of kings. It legitimized social order. If a society had different social layers, the position of people in these layers was legitimized by religion. And religion also supported economic activity, because in ancient India and ancient cities of the world, churches, temples, the mosques, all of these were great economic centers. So ancient trade used to happen around religious places, and religious centers were also places where education was imparted. So education was central to people's lives. Religion was central to people's lives in the past. So what is the so-called religion? And of course, religion created social stability. People would not randomly engage in riots, crime, kill those who they did not like, because they believed if they did sins, somebody from above is watching and they will be punished. So in that sense, religion supported social order and hierarchies, and religion also brought about social stability. But how do we define religion? What is religion? Religion is nothing but a set of beliefs. It's a set of beliefs that deal with some superhuman order. So religion is a set of beliefs dealing with superhuman. So these are the two key features of this definition. That is, so there are a set of beliefs and they deal with superhuman order. And religion can be understood in terms of two criteria. They have two features, that there are two features which can be used to justify or explain what is religion. First, all religions believe that there is a superhuman order. So this is a set of beliefs which is based on some kind of superhuman order, the gods, spirits. So all of this is superhuman order. The future, there will be a great future. There will be a Messiah who will come and save us. And based on this superhuman order, some norms and values are agreed upon, and these norms and values are binding. They are the lubricant, the grease that runs the society. So one, religion believes in a superhuman order. Second, religion establishes some norms and values which are considered binding. So these two things. And most religions that we know today, of course, the early beliefs were not like this, but most religious beliefs we are familiar with today also have these two other elements. They are universal, that is, they have large, we call them world religions. Another way of describing them is world religions. They have a large body of followers and they do some kind of missionary activity. They have places, they have specialists whose job is to go about and find recruits, find converts and spread the message. So that's the other aspect. But how did this all begin? If you rewind a little and go back to our discussion on a day in the life of Adam and Eve, one of the early videos, second or third video. In that video, we described the religious world of a hunter-gatherer. So early man also had crude belief system. We called it animism. So animism was one of the earliest belief system. And what is animism? Animism means belief in spirits, that there are spirits around you and these spirits must be pleased. So people have spirits, plants, animals, all of them have spirits, and you must respect those spirits and you must not harm them. And you are below them. So one should go about his life by appeasing the spirits and the spirit world and not endangering it. So that set of beliefs are called as animism, belief in spirits. For example, based on these spirits, ancient people used to practice beliefs like bans on cutting down particular trees which they believed is the residence of a sacred spirit, or there are some animals. Those animals should not be hunted. You remember there's a tribe in Rajasthan which has black buck as their sacred animal. So when Salman Khan went about hunting it, those tribal people took Salman Khan to court and fought a brave battle. So just like that, all these beliefs centered around spirits is called animism. And animism suited the life of early hunter-gatherers, because in animism, the whole idea is that hunter-gatherers used to be dependent on plants and animals. They were dependent on them, but they never controlled them. As a result, they never felt they were above them. They always felt they were at the mercy or they were dependent on them. So this animistic belief system made them humble and made them look at these animal and plant world with humility and respect, because after all, they did not know how to control them, how to breed them, how to capture them. So they were at their mercy. So animism, this worship of spirits, plants and animals, was a way of cultivating humility, respect, and prevents over-exploitation of these resources they had around them. So it suited the life of a hunter-gatherer. And since each group lived in a different environment, each group had its own belief system. Because somebody is living in one area, their neem tree is more available, so neem tree is their object of worship. Some others are living in desert, some cactus could be their object of worship. Somebody living in hilly area, some deer could be their object of worship. Somebody is in Himalayas, mountain area, a bear could be an object of worship, and so on. Since people are living in different environments, and each environment has its own set of plants and animals that are its unique niche. As a result, the animism was the general pattern that each of them had, but the exact belief system of each group of people was suited to their local condition. So in that sense, the religions, the belief system of each group of people was local. Today there is Christianity in US, it's there in Middle East, it's there in Africa, it's there in India, you go to East, it's there everywhere. But unlike that, those are all world religions. In animism, people had local belief system, and central to animism is the idea that humans always felt they were equal to the plant and animal world in which they lived. Next, people now started agriculture. What happened now? They were in a position to manipulate, selectively breed animals and selectively grow crops, plants. So now people started viewing from perceiving themselves as being a dependent on plants and animals, they began looking at plants as some kind of property. So they could no longer, it became very difficult for them to think of themselves as equals to plants. So they thought they were superior. So they felt they were superior to these plants and plants were their property. But they had one problem. Plants they knew how to manage. But there was one other thing that was beyond their control. What was that? That is the breeding cycle and the life cycle of animals. That people do not know. It only with modern science techniques we know we have things like artificial insemination and breeding and so on. But at that time all this didn't exist. So they had only limited control over animals and their life cycle. So this gave rise to gods, some supernatural power which was some kind of mediator between humans and the plants and animals. So from believing in spirits, they created some fertility gods. Why fertility? Because they believed that they needed somebody who had more animals was rich, and they themselves did not know how to control animals and their life cycle and their population. So this early belief system from animal spirits to some fertility charms, you would have studied in ancient history. In Rigvedic period, fertility goddess is a common goddess across all cultures. People used to worship Yoni and Linga. Why are they worshipping these organs? The reproductive organ worship. All this is because of people's obsession with fertility. Why fertility? Because that's the only way to enrich oneself. In the ancient society, animals were a chief source of wealth. In Rigvedic period, if you remember from ancient history, you will realize that a wealthy man was called Gomat, somebody who had enormous ownership of cattle. So animals were the chief source of wealth. Hence, this from animism, people moved to some sort of fertility worship, and then they had diseases. They didn't know how to heal diseases. So some worship of gods who were supposed to be curing diseases. So in that sense, we moved from animism to creating gods. In animism, there is no god, there are only spirits. So from creating gods, we were just one step to the next phase, that is polytheism. Animism to polytheism. In between, they created gods. Once they created gods, they began giving each god a domain. This is your job role. One god, fertility. Another god, medicine. Another god, rain. So on. So once gods were created, they were given specialization. That led to polytheism. And polytheism took more stronger shape when people, from living in local communities, people started being interconnected, and from village level political systems, as people formed kingdoms and trade networks, a large wider area of people began interacting. Some of them were impersonal interactions. So this large body of interactions was facilitated by polytheistic religions. So polytheistic religions developed because one, people already believed in God. Second, there was expansion of this idea of kingdoms and trade networks. So as kingdoms, large empires and large trade networks began forming. Now it was difficult to have large trade networks when people have local religions. If in one town people have one belief system, another town they have another belief system, and so on. So if these belief systems don't match, it's very difficult to live under a common empire, common ruler. It's difficult for them to have trade with one another. So these issues made people create more non-local, complex religion, and that religion was polytheism. And polytheism was perceived as a reflection of the relationship between gods and humans. So earlier in animism, people believed the role of religion is to mediate between them and plants and animals. But now in polytheism, people saw religion as some kind of reflection between, there are some gods who are above us, and the role of religion is to, the world is nothing but the relationship between man here and God there. Religion was supposed to mediate this relationship between man and God. So God status improved from being local spirits to some heavenly or some extraordinary person. But not just that, human status also improved. Earlier, humans saw themselves as equal to plants and animals, but now they were seeing themselves as exclusive. They thought they were superior, exclusive species, and that religion is only about them and God. All others were chucked out. They were thrown out of the picture. So God, a superior person, his status improved, and man's status also improved. Man, from being an equal to plants and animals, became a special and superior being. So in that sense, through polytheism, humankind status rose vis-a-vis other animals. That's how polytheism changed the whole social structure and whole thinking structure. Polytheism is belief in multiple gods. Each god has its own area of specialization. Second, polytheism allowed establishment of large empires and huge trade networks. And third, as a result of polytheism, the status of God and status of humans all arose, because earlier they were all equals. Human was equal to plants and animals. Now human status improved. That was polytheism. But we are used to thinking polytheism, many followers of monotheists and the West for a long time criticized polytheism. It was considered as foolish and childish ideology, ignorance. Polytheism is ignorance. But Swami Vivekananda, in his speech at World Parliament in Chicago, he shocked the world by saying polytheism is not inferior. You believe in monotheism, we believe in polytheism. Polytheism is our way of thinking, it need not be inferior. It's just a different way of thinking. So polytheism is not an outdated or ignorant ideology. In fact, deeper people who read polytheism deeply understand the real essence of polytheism. The real essence of polytheism is that polytheism believes there is one undisputed supreme power. So the definition in anthropology of polytheism is belief in an undisputed supreme power. But they also believe this undisputed supreme power is a high person. He is not interested in mundane things like rain, food, health. He is about living a higher life that is free from all these human issues. He does not take interest in people's life. So in polytheism, there is this high God, a supreme God. But he is so supreme and so heavenly, he does not take interest in any of this. Under him, there may be many lower gods, junior gods. Each of them has a special area. That's how polytheism is structured. Even in polytheism, there is belief in one supreme God. And there are many lower gods, each with specialization. Hinduism, for example, best fits this. There will be many gods. You approach Ganesha for some mundane success. You may pray for one goddess for success for money, another goddess for education, another god for saving you, another god for taking care of your death, but so on. But a real deeper spiritual Hindu understands the idea that Advaita or monism, that's really the essence of Hinduism. What does it mean? It means that all these multiple gods you are worshipping are nothing but the various manifestations or expressions of the one supreme God, that is Atma, Brahma, the creator. And Hindu philosophy in Upanishads and Gita talks about the ultimate goal, that is moksha, is nothing but to lose oneself in the pursuit of becoming one with the creator. So even in Hinduism, the central belief is that there is the supreme being, and ultimate goal is to realize that the supreme being is one, and your goal is to realize that and become part of him. But that seems very abstract. That's good when it's a life goal. But let's say there's an exam tomorrow and you are worried. How do you get over anxiety? If you think about Atma, creator, you will fail in the exam. So that's why they create a goddess whose specialization in education. You pray to her, then you'll feel, okay, I've prayed to her. It gives you some relief. So for small, regular, mundane activities, they have partial gods, each with specialization. But when one gets over all these mundane issues, even Hinduism is about higher philosophy. So even polytheism has this element of having a higher god. And in general, as a result of this complexity, that yes, they acknowledge one supreme god, but they have flexibility in terms of dealing with day-to-day affairs. So Hindu polytheism is in general slightly more, because of plurality, there is more tolerance and open-mindedness. Now polytheism, over a point of time, since there are special gods, each with special functions, each of these special gods, some cultures tried to create monotheism. From the special gods were taken and they were given importance, and some religious beliefs were tried to cultivate around them. Many efforts were made. So first was polytheism, and there were early efforts to create monotheism. Like Judaism is one such example. There was Roman, it's called paganism, which was a polytheistic. From that came Judaism. But apart from that, many monotheistic efforts were failures. But the real breakthrough came in Christianity. Christianity was the first successful monotheistic religion. Why was it successful? Because the founder of Christianity was an exceptional person. His charisma was so powerful and he attracted many followers, and along with charisma, he made the ultimate sacrifice. That is, he offered himself to death for compassion, and he was killed brutally. This brutal death and this man's willingness to die for his beliefs without any violence gave Christianity huge power. So in that sense, that the man suffering, Jesus' suffering, gave his followers a firm belief that Jesus is a class apart, and his life, his message is worth spreading to the entire world. And that's how Christian missionaries started taking this message across the world, and monotheism took off. So there was polytheism for a long time, very successful. Many monotheistic efforts were made, not successful. Then this man comes, Jesus, and his message and his life and his death shook the conscience of many people, and they were immediately captured, enamored by his message, that they converted to Christianity, and thus the first successful monotheistic religion was born. The same idea was used by another man, but slightly east from where Christ lived, that is Muhammad, the prophet. He also followed Jesus' methods, and he established another religion called Islam. Became very successful, and from being a small religion of a small people in a desert area, in a few centuries, they overran the entire Europe, North Africa, Middle East, and even came till India in the east. Starting from India in the east, they almost conquered till Atlantic Ocean. So that's how these two religions were the first popular monotheistic religions. In that sense, the world history of the last 2000 years, or at least last 1500 years, was nothing but one of success of these two monotheistic faiths. So this is a map that shows here the spread of both Christianity and Islam. Yes, I just forgot another important point. That is, Christianity, though the Christ died in the first year of this AD, as we call it, but it did not become popular until some 400 AD. That is because around that time, one Roman emperor, he embraced Christianity, Constantine. Until then, though Christianity existed, it was remote. They were like a small group, and Roman Empire never supported Christianity. Roman emperors believed in paganism, polytheism. But Constantine was a Roman emperor who converted to Christianity. Just like Ashoka's conversion to Buddhism in India gave Buddhism huge momentum. Until then it was not a major religion. But the moment Ashoka converted to Buddhism, Buddhism got enormous thrust. Ashoka used all his might, power and resources to spread the message of Buddha. Similarly, Constantine's conversion to Christianity gave Christianity a huge push. That's why Constantinople, that town, Istanbul's old name, or the town that is in Turkey, is a very popular town. It is named after that Roman emperor called Constantine. So that's how monotheism developed. Now, while polytheism One set of polytheistic beliefs gave rise to monotheism. Another set of polytheistic beliefs gave rise to dualism. What is dualism? Monotheism means belief that there is one God who is good. This God created the world, he takes care of order. Polytheism believes in existence of both good and bad. That there is a good in the world, there is bad in the world, evil in the world, and the world is nothing but a fight between these two. Zoroastrianism, followers of this are called as Parsis, is an example of dualistic religion. There were many other, but many of them died out. So again a brief recap: animism, then the concept of God came in, then polytheism, from polytheism we had monotheism, from polytheism we also had dualism. But all these are the basis of all these, animism to dualism and monotheism, is the idea that there is God, some belief system around some supernatural power. But there were another set of belief systems where there is no God. You will be shocked. To be a religion, one need not believe in God. These are called as natural law religions. They believed in some kind of natural law, that there is a natural law in the world and we are guided by it. There is no person doing all these things. An example of that is Buddhism. So in these natural law religions, they may believe that God exists. Buddhism of course doesn't believe in God. There are many others which believe in God. So they believe that there may be God, but this God is no different from plants and animals. He is just one another person. Just like plants and animals have their niche in the environment, these gods have their place. That's it. There is nothing exceptional about them. But Buddhism was one such religion which was natural law religion. So to understand this natural law concept, let us try to understand Buddhism briefly. What does Buddhism prescribe? You know the story, right? Buddha, prince, saw some 4 events, changed his perspective, he saw that they were suffering, left the palace and went about finding truth and finally discovered truth. Now what is the truth that Buddha discovered? Buddha discovered that people are going through suffering. And this suffering is not because of social injustice. The suffering is not because of poverty maybe. The suffering is not because of any other extraordinary event. But he believed suffering is because of mind. His idea was that people are suffering because of some pointless rat race. The source of suffering is desire, he said. People have, and the source of suffering is in the nature of mind. So people are suffering. This suffering is not because of some external factors. He's saying suffering is because of internal factors. What is the internal factor? Mind. He says suffering is because of the nature of mind. The nature of mind is to crave. He says mind is always craving. If it is in pain, it wants to quickly end the pain. If you are hurt, you want to get out of it. If you are happy, you want to keep the happiness and pleasure. You are worried the pleasure may disappear soon. So mind is always craving. And this constant craving, constant need or constant nature of mind to crave is the basis of suffering. So he says the way to end suffering is not to procure wealth, is not to chase success. Because you see many people who are wealthy and successful still suffering. So he says suffering is not ended by all those things, material things. Suffering is ended through changing, understanding the way of mind and changing it. To understand and get over these cravings, he said, to get over cravings, one must learn to live in the present, enjoy the present, appreciate the present. So suffering is caused by craving. Craving is because of constant obsession with future, and the way to escape all this suffering cycle is to focus on the present. And how do you do that? For that, Buddha developed some meditation techniques, and once you practice this, he said, anybody can attain nirvana. Nirvana is means extinguishing the fire of desire, extinguishing this enormous desire to crave. So once this is done, he said, people will overcome suffering. No amount of other things can end suffering. That is Buddhism. So Buddhism is nothing but it's a natural law religion. There is no God here. He's saying, he's giving some kind of spiritual or some principles that you follow which will give you a higher experience. They need not worship. In Buddhism, Buddha doesn't prescribe worship, rituals and all this. He only prescribes meditation and a simple living. So that is because he believes there is a natural law in the world, a natural law which if you follow will end your suffering. There need not be any God to help you overcome your suffering. So these are other set of beliefs, that is natural law religions. They are not theistic, there is no God in them. So Buddhism, Jainism, all are examples of natural law. Confucianism, Taoism, these are all examples of natural law religions. Of course, natural law religions are not just in the ancient society. We also have some modern natural law religions, the new natural law religions. Because as a philosopher called Nietzsche said, he said, we are all living in post-God world. So if somebody in 21st century says, there is Jesus, somebody as good as Jesus is born in 21st century, wants to create a new religion and says, I am the founder of this religion, I am son of God. He won't be successful, because in our age nobody believes in God, because we live in a post-God world. People are not looking for new gods. People are looking for science, but new ideologies. More importantly, new ideologies. We are living in a marketplace of ideologies. So these new natural law religions are nothing but ideologies we all prescribe by, like liberalism, capitalism, socialism, nationalism, feminism. These are all the new natural law religions. You may be shocked why I am calling them religions. You want them to be called ideologies. Doesn't matter, ideology or religion, but they are essentially some beliefs we all hold. And just like Buddha believed suffering can be broken in a particular way, Karl Marx believed the suffering of the poor can be overcome if you follow certain rules. We'll discuss that. So we also have this new natural law religions, and in all of them worship humanity. They center around Homo sapien. They believe that Homo sapiens have a unique nature. They are unique. Homo sapiens have a unique nature, and the supreme good in the world is nothing but the good of Homo sapiens. So they think that any law, any natural law should appreciate the uniqueness of humans, and it should work for their good. So these are the new natural law religions. And so communism, for example, is a natural law religion, and you may be surprised in calling it religion and why I am not calling it ideology. It is very similar. Just take this example between Buddhism and communism, very similar. So Karl Marx was a person who founded communism. He founded a book. He founded this idea. So Karl Marx, if he was born earlier, would have been another Jesus Buddha. Just like any other Buddhism, Christianity and Islam, Karl Marx, founder, wrote a book, like Bible you have his book, the Communist Manifesto. He said some things, and there were many who believed in what he said. They're all called communists. Lenin, Mao, Sri, Naxalite, so many people in the world took him so seriously that they did extreme things to get his message through. And just like in every religion there is a sacred book, they also have sacred book, Das Kapital or Communist Manifesto. And every religion has sacred days like Christmas and so on. So Buddha Purnima in Buddhism, communists also have a sacred day, 1st May, May Day. That is the day of October Revolution. So these modern ideologies that we think of as ideologies are also very similar to religion. We just don't want to call them religions. And of all these modern religions, the new natural law religions, liberalism has been the most widely accepted. Humanism, it's not liberalism, it's humanism. Humanism has been most widely believed. What is humanism? Humanism believes in these principles that we enlisted here. It worships humanity, it believes in the unique nature of Homo sapiens, and it assumes that the supreme good is nothing but the good of Homo sapiens. So this is the basis of humanism. And within humanism there are 3 sects. Just like in Buddhism you have Mahayana, Hinayana and Vajrayana and so on. Within Christianity you have Protestant, Syrian Catholic, Roman Catholic and so on. You also have 3 rival sects in humanism. What are they? Liberal humanism, social humanism and evolutionary humanism. Liberal humanism is most widely popular today. It believes in the rights of individuals. It believes that people have rights and these rights are sacrosanct, governments should not violate them. So human rights, belief in human rights for example, is a chief characteristic of liberal humanism. Many liberal humanists believe that the government should not use torture, we must not punish with death penalty, even a criminal, a terrorist must not be given death penalty. By treating him better, we display that we have superior human character. So that is liberal humanism. Socialist humanism thinks, liberal humanism believes that individual is the most important thing. So they emphasize on rights because they give importance to individual. Social humanism believes the collective of people is more important than any one individual. So they don't emphasize on rights, they emphasize on justice. Equality is their chief concern. So Russia, communist Russia, China for example, all of them are trying to achieve equality. So socialist humanism, their agenda is to achieve equality because they believe the group is important, and for the group to survive, the group must not have inequalities, so there must be equality. Then there is evolutionary humanism. Evolutionary humanism is an extreme form and very dangerous. This believes that humankind is changeable, mutable species, and it can evolve or degenerate. This is some kind of social Darwinism. They combine ideas of Darwinism to apply them to humans in society and create this theory. They believe humans can improve or they can become worse. So governments or those in power must use power and policies to progressively improve human biological stock. Very scary, isn't it? We call all this eugenics. And the most famous follower of this was the Nazi regime in Germany, and Hitler strongly believed in this. Hitler's Germany strongly believed in this kind of evolutionary humanism. They believed some people like this were not so fit, these were the ideal type. So these people must not be allowed to reproduce. These people must have more children. Far from that, these people, it's okay to kill them. These people must multiply. And transgenders, homosexuals, Jews, all of them were inferior race. They are a burden, a liability to humankind, so they must be exterminated. Whereas the Aryan pure race have pure blood, they must be allowed to grow. Using this kind of thinking, Hitler perpetuated mass violence that humanity has not seen. Some 6 million Jews were killed in gas chambers, all because one man had a crazy idea that humankind can evolve and become better. And he took upon the holy job of making them better by getting rid of what he perceived as inferior stock. That led to Holocaust, concentration camps, and 6 million Jews were mercilessly killed by this lunatic who had a crazy idea. So again, just like others, Hitler had his own religious thinking, that is Nazism, and Nazism was based on evolutionary humanism. So this is a cartoon that describes all this. So this is the story of religion. I hope you enjoyed it. We'll come back with the next video. We'll move on to scientific revolution and take up the changes that it caused. Until then, goodbye. Thank you.